breaking free. Yeah, we're breaking free. No more oppression. It's out for liberty, breaking free. Yeah, we're taking a stand. Freedom's in our hearts, we're reclaiming our land. They try to silence us, but we won't be tamed. Voices getting louder, can't keep us in chains. We got the power, we got the might. Together we can shine, together we can fight. Feel the rhythm in your feet, it's time to stand tall. Raise your voice and shout, we're breaking down the walls. We're breaking free, yeah, we're breaking free. No more oppression, it's out for liberty, breaking free. Yeah, we're taking a stand. Freedom's in our hearts, we're reclaiming our land. We're claiming our land.
I hate this show. Oh my goodness.
And like I said, couldn't think of anything scarier than the federal government. So
Indeed.
the game this week is called Ghoulish Policies That Haunt Our Town.
Nice.
So I think that a lot of these federal policies, like I said, where we have to pay the federal taxes and then wait for our money to return via grants or infrastructure projects or however they're coming back, I think that they're killing our towns. And while we give tax breaks and subsidies to these mega corporations that don't even need them, Main Street in so many towns is just being decimated. And they're basically, a ghost town like I'm showing here. Not literally ghosts, but a ghost town, right? I want to talk about these ghoulish policies that are haunting our towns and turning our towns into ghost towns. Basically, what you're going to do here is choose the option that undermines the local communities striving for strong, self-reliant economies and resilient autonomous communities. So basically same kind of thing, but with a little bit of a Halloween twist on it. The federal minimum wage or a federal sales tax?
Federal minimum wage, I'm going to say, is worse.
Interesting. Why you say that?
I say this because it doesn't, more so than a sales tax, which is a consumption tax. I'm getting a little Gary Johnson here, but a consumption tax, you can kind of work your way around that. But a federal minimum wage is typically a one size fits all. And let's face it, the economies of scale is not taken into account. That's one of my biggest grievances about the federal government controlling anything. Is that it's coming from the top down as a one size fits all format, and it doesn't take into account the uniqueness of whole regions, let alone states, or let alone just township at the smallest level. It can be sometimes different, like the economies of scale can be different from one part of the state to the other, let alone between different states. From one region, even in different townships, the economies of scale can be very different. The cost of living can be different. And when you start trying to stamp a one size fits all wage on the entire country, it's actually quite a ludicrous idea when you think about how different economies are from one state to the next, let alone even in smaller increments. So I think that one's worse because a federal sales tax, although it's still obviously not great at all, it's a consumption tax, and there's ways townships can devise to get people to not have to transact in that fashion, right? Where it gets recorded by a federal tax authority or what have you. So I think the first one, the federal income or federal sales tax, is a little more nullifiable. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. I mean, because I would go with the sales tax because I think any additional taxes that they put on would just be more control going there. Many states are already above the federal minimum wage. I think it hurts the poorer states for sure, and it drives business away from them. But so would a federal sales tax. So I don't trust the federal sales tax either. I know Casey likes the idea of the fair tax. I just don't trust the government to do anything fair. And
there's nothing fair about anything that the federal government would ever do. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that I feel that I could subvert a federal sales tax more than a minimum wage requirement. I think that's actually easier to kind of circumvent. Now, we can argue the mechanics of it. Both of them are oppressive and shouldn't exist, of course. I think I could get around, like if I'm a local entrepreneur, I think it'd be easier for me to get around a sales tax or a federal sales tax, and it'd be easier to have and this is the agorist in me, It'd be easier to create a black market for transactions than a black market for labor. That's the only reason why because I'm thinking in terms of like a counter economy.
Federal laws were about overtime pay or mandatory sick pay policies.
Probably the mandatory sick days, although they certainly have some popular weight. I think those could be the more, again, it's difficult to see any good coming from a one size fits all format that would come from from the federal government down to the township level. I would imagine they would be more invasive with sick days and so forth. That's just my knee jerk take on it. But I think that would be a little worse, in terms of breaking that down and whatnot to the local level.
I think that anytime you start messing with time off, then you start to get into all of their woke policies, and you could have all sorts of things where, people are getting more time off than they should. And then you got all sorts of problems.
Right. The potential for abuse from top to bottom is broader in that option.
Occupational licensing or wage transparency laws.
I'm going to go with occupational licensing just because it bugs the crap out of me personally. And that's just my initial, I hear that and I just go, cringe. I think occupational license, I mean, you're it's just, I'm just going to say that and leave it at that, because that one just bothers me a little bit personally, because occupational licensing is a racket in so many ways and so many levels, privately and from the perspective of the government. So I'm going to say it's pet peeve of mine. So yeah, I'm going to go with that one.
Property taxes or capital gains taxes.
Oh, wow. That's almost the same poison. I'd say property tax is a little bit more insidious, but man, are those two closely aligned. But I'd say property tax is a little more insidious because you're basically not owning anything. You don't actually own it. You're basically renting from the government, and at any level, at any stage in your ownership of said property, that you're never fully the owner because you're paying property tax. So that's a little more onerous than capital gains, although capital gains that's a close second, and really is almost the same formula of poison.
Another scary thing that the government does is surveillance and the control that comes with being Big Brother. The first one in this category is surveillance cameras in all public areas or facial recognition software in public buildings.
There's a fine line. I can kind of get the safety thing in a so-called public area. I still don't like it, but I can get it. But facial recognition, no, man. There's no way that's not a straight up unquestionable invasion of privacy. There's a reasonable what do they say oftentimes? There's no reasonable assumption to privacy. Come on, facial recognition is next level. There's no justification for that. If you've got a camera and you can make out something, chances are you'll get all the information you need in this hypothetical crime you're trying to prevent. But facial recognition is next level. And what's worse is that, to me, it kind of also enters into what artificial intelligence might eventually be able to do, or really already probably does. It just hasn't been deployed. So yeah, that adds a whole nother can of worms to an already ridiculous level of surveillance that we have.
Digital ID or mandatory GPS tracking.
A pair of things. Once again, they're close cousins in terms of their poisonous effect. Digital ID, I'd say the GPS. I think tracking my movements is more invasive than using digital ID. I mean, I would just avoid using things or doing things that would require me to provide ID. I could conceivably do that. And again, I'm thinking counter economics, parallel society stuff. But having to surrender my movements, that's something that's an ankle bracelet. That's something free people shouldn't be required to do for any reason.
So I think I'd go the opposite route here. I'd go. Okay. I'm going digital ID because you would have to use that all the time. I'm sure it would become even more prevalent. Like you'd have to use it for public transportation, for example. And then once you get the government into your device, what else can they do? That would worry me. I kind of feel like John McAfee when we talk about stuff like this, but kind of think they're already in your phone if
Yeah,
you're not a
right there.
you know
Yeah.
a top-notch security and encryption expert, so they're probably already on your phone. But I think digital ID and having to use that to leave a digital footprint, to check out a library book or whatever, I think that that's going to be more intrusive. I feel like I could get a car from Dune and tool around in that if I needed to.
Yeah, now why I can understand that. Why I am giving you the answers I'm giving you is because I'm analyzing in my head not so much what I could do, but what I know, what friends of mine know how to do and could teach me or whatever on how to avoid, certain, like what's more avoidable, what form of oppression is more avoidable. If somebody is like GPS thing, I mean, how could you? I guess you could kind of avoid certain things too. If you could trick digital ID, you could trick GPS. But yeah, I think the motion, like knowing your every move, that just triggers a paranoid like response in me to the point where that's actually more like everybody knows my exact movements in the government. Oh man, yeah, I wouldn't. That gives me the heebie-jeebies in a Halloween sense.
All right, so let's do education next. Standardized testing or state control of curriculum?
I'm going to say state control of curriculum. Again, I'm looking at this like what is the more avoidable form of oppression? You can have standardized testing and then still have your own testing, which is more rooted in regional value, so to speak, and regional evaluation. Like I can almost see like school systems and school boards like going through the motions of a standardized test and then not really caring, right? Especially if they're working their way into a complete liberation from the state apparatus. But if the state can control your curriculum and has to approve all curriculum, that's just too much centralized. It's a little too much centralized power. Testing only could do so much, at least by comparison. Both are evil. Don't get me wrong, as all your all your test questions are here are a choice between two evils. But I think the state being in control of the curriculum is a little more invasive.
State control of school nutrition or the cutting of arts and physical education?
I'm going to say the cutting of arts and physical education would be worse because state controlling the nutrition of the lunches that go out. I just know, like, for example, my now 17-year-old would never darken the doorway of the cafeteria, right, for any reason his entire scholastic career. And he's in his senior year of high school. So I don't really think that's, I think there is a built-in avoidance to that kind of nonsense. But on the other hand, athletics being cut, the arts being cut, again, the government should be running any of this stuff anyway. It should not be up to the government to provide any of this, right? Because there's always a catch to that. But that would be worse because for all intents and purposes, physical education is something that it's a vital part of being a growing growing child, so to speak. And not to mention the arts are also, what little creative, input they get in this kind of government run schooling environment, that anything that is artistic in nature is going to help critical thinking more so than what they're probably getting in the standard classroom.
All right, financial surveillance and currency controls. So a federal backed digital currency or regulations or bans on cryptocurrencies and barter systems.
If you pose a digital currency, then there's too many people who would fall victim to that, that it makes everything else much more difficult. It's instant slavery. So for everyone, and those of us who want to create this parallel society and this counter economy are going to have a much harder time if that gets implemented. Whereas, all your little rules and regulations, and you can't do this and you can't do that, and you can't trade or barter. How are you going to try? How most of that stuff can't even be effectively policed to begin with. So yeah, I'm far less intimidated by the second choice than I am by digital currency.
Federal know your customer regulations for banks or IRS reporting requirements for all transactions over $600.
I'd say the IRS. They're too pervasive. I think as far as your banks, being required to do that, you don't have to go to financial institutions. You can always negotiate. You can always form your own financial institution. Again, of those two choices, the more avoidable one is the first, so I'm going to go with the second. I think the IRS is a little too pervasive already and a little more difficult to avoid.
Vaccine health and safety,
Oh, boy.
vaccine mandates or mandated quarantine and lockdowns.
I would say if actually this applies to the state as well. See, both of those have been circumvented and effectively nullified in the city of Huntington Beach in California. The city council just passed a counteracting ordinance that said the exact reverse of what was coming out of Sacramento. So since I think you're talking about the state versions, right, of lockdowns and vaccine mandates and various other things, I'm going to go with the one that I think is probably the most egregious, even though both of them are essentially avoidable if you know how to if you have a good hold over your local governing body. That's I think of the two. I think the vaccine requirement is probably a little more invasive and a little less avoidable than a lockdown, right? Because even down to the individual business, I've known people, like for example, another one in Huntington Beach, the Tony Romo, who owns Basilicos, is notorious epicenter for non-compliance with lockdown laws and social distancing, mask requirements, any of that kind of stuff. He managed to never get shut down in spite of violating those the state ordinances that Huntington Beach until November of 2022 was enforcing. So again, I think there's more opportunity for avoidance with lockdown requirements, although it's still innocuous and still difficult, than say vaccine requirements. That's, I think, more noxious because of just an absolute violation. I mean, they're both absolute violations of your constitutional rights. But I think a forced vaccination is also like a direct violation of Nuremberg and many other international standards for individual rights and for human rights. So I think I'd have to go with the vaccine requirements and so forth, vaccine mandates.
Fast we can. Federal grants ultimately weaken a community's independence.
Absolutely agree.
Local projects funded by federal grants often end up serving federal interests over local needs.
Absolutely, yes.
Government grants lead to long-term reliance on outside funding, compromising local self-sufficiency.
Yes.
Federal taxes on small business income. Taxes on small businesses and local businesses take money out of the local economy that's been proven to improve the local economy. That money would be reinvested locally in many cases and would fuel local innovation and job growth. So the question really becomes, is the biggest threat to a town's prosperity Washington's tax policies? First one would be local businesses should have the freedom to reinvest without regulation or tax burden.
Well, yes, absolutely. That's also something that they don't seem to want to allow local and small businesses to be able to do. That's absolutely what they should be able to do.
Local businesses would create more jobs if they kept more of their earnings.
Yes, absolutely. as would we as individuals, right? Essentially. I mean, we spend money where we live.
All right. So I tried to throw some in that weren't just no-brainers. So here's one. Small businesses should be taxed at a different rate than large corporations.
That's a good one. That's a good not so. I would say yes, and here's why. I think small businesses should be tax exempt altogether until they reach a certain threshold. And of course, even then, ultimately, I don't think any business, any individual, anybody should be taxed whatsoever. But if we're going to do a hypothetical, like what's a good sell, what's a good step in the right direction incrementally, I'd say small businesses being completely tax free until a certain threshold is met would be a nice step in the right direction incrementally towards just no taxation whatsoever.
I agree. My next one is surveillance and control. And just like in the scary movies, lurking in the shadows, the government is always surveilling us.
Somebody's watching.
The surveillance strips away community autonomy and gives the government just a crazy amount of oversight into our lives and our private thoughts. The scary statistics on this one are there's over 200 million cameras now in the US that track citizens real time. The government holds almost 7 billion private data points on American citizens that we haven't given consent to. Data collected by over 75% of government agencies is shared across federal and local entities. And that's got to be secure. They're not just, leaking our data left and right. Over 10 billion is spent annually on mass surveillance, and that money is probably coming from somewhere that it could be used better. 80% of Americans are starting to get paranoid about being watched by the government, creating this fear environment, which is appropriate for our Halloween theme.
Yes, it is.
Government surveillance extends to over a third of all local businesses tracking transactions and customer data. 80% of smartphone data is accessible to government agencies under the current surveillance laws. Drones have logged over 400,000 hours doing surveillance over US cities in the last year. 2,000 plus private corporations collaborate with the government on community data sharing. And surveillance programs are now in effect in over 60% of all towns under quote unquote security partnerships with federal agencies. The one I wanted to highlight here is government surveillance on local transactions. I don't think anybody's talking about this. You know, we think about the cameras and the biometrics, but the way they track our transactions is just absolutely crazy. So, you know, the government is monitoring even local level financial transactions now. You know, so basically the question becomes, is Big Brother tracking our community's commerce, and what are they doing with that data? Should local transactions remain private, free from government oversight?
100%. And the fact that they're not is disturbing. You know, you really called out one of the, there's a lot of really disturbing things about that list of scary things that the government does. There's a lot of things that shouldn't be happening. There's some, in fact, let's put this another way. There's very few of those things that are even remotely justifiable. I think we come back to the earlier part of our discussion. Cameras, ostensibly, okay, you're going to have cameras. You're for to survey people who are out in public. That's a little bit better than having, you know, again, I'm not real keen on this either necessarily, but you know, when you have police cars out on patrol, it's the same kind of thing. You're kind of just tracking things in case something pops off. Hypothetically, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I don't think it's used the way it should, and that's another. But literally none of the other things you mentioned, the data collection in particular of any kind, should be done on peaceful Americans that have not committed a crime, that are innocent until proven guilty. That type of data collection that's been going on for 20 years that we know about, it shouldn't exist. So when you start talking about our small scale financial transactions, that should be completely off limits. There should be no, I mean, there's already too much. What is it, $600? They want to know if your transaction exceeds more than $600 or some crazy thing. I mean, in California, you can shoplift more value than that legally.
That's a great point.
Right? You know, it's like that. That's absurd and inconsistent. And you know, why would you have any excuse to monitor something on that scale if it isn't for absolute tyranny and to further the aims of a dystopia? There's no other reason for it. So it absolutely needs to be nullified, or, you know, Zach and I will go on a diatribe if you let us. You know, we create a counter economy that doesn't even, you know, that's completely untrackable, black markets or free markets, et cetera, et cetera. But that needs to end as soon as possible. That is nullification. That's one of the main nullification targets we should have, because there's no excuse for it. It's dystopian with no other justifiable purpose.
The federal government is discouraging cash-based transactions.
I've actually heard some mixed commentary on this, but I would say so, because they would prefer, obviously, to not use cash, right? I think that's our government's preference. So I'm going to go ahead and say yes, although I've heard some other angles to that might, you know, I need to dive a little bit more into some alternative perspective on that, but knee-jerk reaction, I'd say yes.
All right, so my next one is land ownership and zoning. Communities should have the right to refuse eminent domain claims.
Absolutely, yes. Nullify it outright. Nullify the very practice of eminent domain.
I gotta tee a few up for you to talk about nullifying, or you'll get twitchy and freeze up again. You know.
I know. Maybe that's why the device is switching out on me, because I'm not able to talk about nullification. But you know, we touched on it. That's perfect. A perfect example of something that needs to be nullified.
So here's an interesting one. Community members should vote on eminent domain proposals.
No, because I think eminent domain shouldn't be on the menu for anyone, for any reason. Yeah, it is so evil, Zach. Eminent domain shouldn't be on the menu for any reason. And zoning, okay, let's talk about zoning. Zoning, in theory, isn't necessarily a bad thing, provided it is strictly localized, but it's not. There's way too much state level and federal level interference in local ordinances for zoning. And that's, that shouldn't happen. There should be no state involvement. There should be no federal involvement in zoning whatsoever. And there should be no practice of eminent domain, even at the local level. It just shouldn't exist. It should not be happening. No one should be able to vote on it. Now, should local residents be able to vote on various restrictions with regards to zoning? Like, hey, I don't mind. It's like, I understand people have the right to partake in certain things I don't approve of, but can we zone that? Zone the weed shops over here, or the mushroom shops, or the psychedelic shops over in this corner of town rather than in my neighborhood. I think that's an acceptable use of zoning, because it's strictly based on the local community, on the local township. It's decided strictly at the local level, the town council township level. Beyond anything above and beyond that is an infringement, and there's no reason why a state or even a county, let alone the federal government, should have any say in those zoning decisions. And eminent domain shouldn't be on the menu.
It's interesting because the negative comment to libertarians all the time is, what about the roads, right? Well, to me, it seems like if we didn't have roads and we needed roads now, that should be when zoning takes place. If you don't take a road from the government, they shouldn't have any say in what you do with your land, and, so it's kind of interesting that, like, if you look at it backwards that way, like, what if I just don't take your services and then you can't zone me, So we talked about education and culture a little bit. Obviously, federal influence over education and culture pushes uniformity over individuality and has been eroding local values and local culture for quite some time. So, scary statistics: 80% of K-12 funding comes with federal stipulations that limit local control over curriculum. The government influences 95% of all public school curriculum guidelines. $2 billion is annually spent on cultural programs with top-down agendas. Federal education standards replace 40% of locally curated courses each year. 1/3 of public school teachers report feeling pressured to teach federally mandated subjects. Local school boards must comply with over 300 federal guidelines. $10 billion is spent on federal education compliance, money local schools could use elsewhere. 43 states now have centralized testing tied to federal standards affecting local teaching methods, and 25% of local cultural events are at risk of losing funding due to federal policy shifts. The scary one here is the national education standard. Local communities know their educational needs better than a federal agency does.
100, yes, absolutely, 100%, absolutely, yes.
Schools should have the freedom to set their own curriculum.
Absolutely.
Here's one that might take a little thought. Local culture and values should be integrated into education.
I would say that's up to the local community, right? On the surface, that sounds more than reasonable. But again, with the radical decentralization of education that I'm thinking of, I'm conceiving of, I'd say that really is kind of, it's up to the local community, how much of the local color and culture they would want to make part of their curriculum. I think there's, like, for example, I certainly wouldn't have a problem with it where I live. I mean, not that there's a whole lot of culture in South Orange County, California. Actually, we're kind of lacking in that sense. Surf culture, maybe, which would be fine with me. Yeah, but I'd say that it's up to the local community, and it would make sense, I think, in most instances.
All right, so the next one's infrastructure control. And another one I don't think we talk about enough is community resilience. And I think that federal control over local infrastructure is placing community resilience at risk.
Yes.
And also putting safety at risk when critical repairs are not done on time. So some scary statistics here. Federal funding comes with 50% more strings attached for infrastructure projects than state funds do. 70% of highway budgets are controlled by federal programs, so limiting local prioritization. Local water systems in 60% of towns are required to meet federal standards, even at prohibitive costs. Federal regulations drive up 40% of the delays in local infrastructure repair and development. 20% of all bridges fail to meet local repair standards due to waiting for federal approval. $10 billion in local infrastructure funds have been redirected to federal priorities. Federal control of public transit systems is mandatory for cities with populations over 200,000. I did not know that one.
Wow. Okay.
85% of natural disaster funds for infrastructure require the sign off of a federal agency. Local infrastructure proposals are rejected 4 times more often when federal funds are involved. And federal agencies hold jurisdiction over 65% of all public lands, even lands within city limits. The scary one here is the mandates on infrastructure projects. So federal infrastructure mandates can force communities to prioritize certain projects over others, regardless of what the actual need is. So the question becomes, could federal infrastructure mandates be a wolf in sheep's clothing for local needs? So
yeah, it very much is, right? And I appreciate the danger that you're describing. Again, we're dealing with a one size fits all, top down solution that isn't a solution, and in fact is probably causing more problems than it will ever solve. So yeah, that's another huge problem. You know what else is kind of scary that you mentioned is it's scary how good you are at finding these statistics over a relatively short period of time. That's also kind of, I mean, it's scary to me because wow, you're rattling off statistics like everybody should know this, and really nobody. You're like the only one talking about it, which is why there's such a fantastic discussion every time. But that is a scary statistic because we're watching that play out, that danger of that play out in real time recently, not just there in Florida, but anywhere in the path of this recent set of hurricanes has been obviously there's been a real lack of local input on their own safety, on their own like emergency response. And that lack of organic response is playing out in real time as something that was actually quite dangerous. And there is incredible room for improvement. And again, another justification for radical decentralization. Yet another example of where we need radical decentralization.
So another one that I'm huge on is criminal justice reform. Federal mandates in the local criminal justice systems shift the power away from communities, prioritizing the national agenda over local safety. 1/3, here's the scary statistics, 1/3 of all police training follows federal standards rather than community-based needs. 20% of all criminal charges in the US stem from federal offenses affecting local courts. Federal sentencing guidelines influence 90% of all local court cases. 80% of local police departments receive federal grants that dictate operational standards and the militarization of local police. I added the last part. Federal prison funding accounts for 70% of all incarceration spending. 60% of local policing costs are subsidized federally, often with attached requirements. 3 out of 4 police departments are encouraged to adopt federal surveillance tools. So, I mean, that's a huge number. $2.6 billion is allocated yearly for federal directives in local law enforcement. 4 out of 5 local judges report feeling pressured to comply with federal sentencing expectations. They could nullify, right? 500,000 people were prosecuted under federal mandates in local jurisdictions last year alone. The scary thing, obviously, the federal oversight, so who should be policing your local community? The people that actually live there, or, these idiots in DC? Local communities should have primary authority in law enforcement.
100%. And that speaks of the sheriff model, which again, as somebody who's kind of a law enforcement skeptic, I can honestly say, for the most part, although there are still a lot of stupid laws in the books in California that these guys have to enforce, and I go back and forth with that, but for the most part, I'm pretty happy with my local sheriff. They're accountable to the people. They have to get elected. There is a certain amount of transparency that's built into the office of sheriff, and given a choice between living in a township that has a sheriff department or a city PD, I'll pick the sheriff every time because there's more accountability in that model. And not to mention the fact that I bet you, although you could probably break this down, maybe this is a good thing to follow up with next week. I'd say a lot of the federal involvement and the sort of federal manipulation of local police departments, I think you're going to find that more times than not, it's city police that have more in influence and manipulation coming from the federal level than sheriffs, which tend to be county based with certain city or township branches. And again, I got to sing the praises of more than a handful of county-wide sheriff's departments in California that absolutely refuse to enforce any of the nonsense coming out of Sacramento. So if I was going to look for allies to stem the dystopia coming out of Sacramento, I have to look at a significant handful of sheriff departments across the state of California. So but again, that's a better model. Whether that actually pans out into better actions, I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I also know of terrible abuse of power among sheriffs, just as like among city cops. So I'm not saying that they should be granted qualified immunity or anything like that. But I do appreciate that at least the model and transparency of a sheriff model for all the reasons that you just defined, because I think that's where the accountability should be. There should be more accountability to the local community. I don't think you're going to get that as much with city cops.
Emergency and disaster management, right? The question here becomes, do federal disaster protocols leave your community high and dry?
I mean, I would say by comparatively, yes. I think that there's some good that can still, I mean, there's still some attention being paid that eventually they get around to doing what they're supposed to do, I suppose. But the reality is, each one of these topics and the flurry of statistics that you come up to support the topic remind us that the top-down model doesn't work. The one-size-fits-all doesn't work, and that needs to be discouraged, nullified, counteracted. Lack of compliance, whatever you want to say, that it all needs to stop in favor of a more localized network, a more localized response policy and protocol needs to be put in place for any of this sort of stuff. And yes, you're right. By the way, California is notorious for fires and whatnot, which of course get blamed on man-made climate change by Sacramento. I don't want to tell you how pervasive, by the way, that is. All climate change features prominently in everything that the state regulates. There's real estate requirements that licensing requirements that have to do with climate change. It's all driven by climate. Everything's climate change. So the reality is, though, even that's not really effective. The regional areas need to be able to determine much more how they deal with the potential crisis. Their own rainy day funds and so on need to be established, and also a protocol arranged to work with and coordinate with other regions, because no matter what type of disaster we're talking about, whether it's an earthquake, I've been hearing about the big one since I was a little kid, whether it's the fires that we always get every year, and the subsequent landslides and various other mudslides that kind of come with that danger, or in Florida, obviously, and the southeast, the constant threat of hurricanes and whatnot. None of that is going to be dealt with that great or that well in a top-down, one-size-fits-all model. And yet, that's what everybody. It seems like they're aggressively forcing regional and local governments to comply with that. And again, yet another example of something that needs to be nullified and rethought and rebuilt from the bottom up.
My next one is digital rights and digital privacy, and data privacy. So we've talked about this a little bit, but I don't think people really understand how much the government is surveilling us basically all the time and everything we do. And then what they do with that data is sketchy as well, and has all sorts of problems that I don't think that the federal government should be involved in at all.
Right.
So the scary stats are 80% of internet data flows through servers in the US that can be accessed by government agencies. The federal government has 4 million data collection programs that monitor internet usage. 4 million. 3 in 4 Americans report concerns over government access to private online data. And then the other 25% obviously aren't paying attention.
Right.
Federal data sharing extends to 90% of local law enforcement agencies. 1/3 of local businesses must comply with federal digital privacy regulations. Over 40 million data requests are made by federal agencies each year. 40 million. $9 billion is spent annually on data monitoring by federal agencies, and that's the lower of the numbers I've seen. I've seen much higher. 2 in 3 local communities report interference in data privacy policies by the federal authorities. Federal data policies affect 60% of municipal records stored online, and half of all Americans have had their personal data collected by federal agencies at least once. Again, I don't think people realize like how much of that's going on. The question from a nullification standpoint is, what do you do about how closely Big Brother is watching our communities?
Yeah, that's one of those things that is going to require very targeted attention, because I don't think, like as you said, I think most people are unaware of it. I think the fact is that the Fourth and Fifth Amendments are, but just by what you do, I mean, there's not one of those things you mentioned that isn't a violation of our fundamental Fourth and Fifth Amendment rights as Americans in the Bill of Rights. And until there's enough of an uproar, I don't know if we're going to get the nullification that we need, but it needs to start somewhere. So I think education is one of the most important things. Those statistics that you just rattled off, we need to broadcast that. Whether it's, I mean, we both, the two of us, we should repost those regularly on X, just to kind of put it out there that this is yet another viable target. Because there's certain things that the federal government doesn't, that is doing that local governing bodies should do, that should be delegated to the local governing bodies, that should be decentralized. And there's certain things like eminent domain and this level of data collection that shouldn't be happening at all. It needs to be ended. So there's something a little more aggressive about nullifying this level of data collection, just like we should nullify the practice altogether of eminent domain. It's the same kind of animal that just shouldn't exist in a supposedly free country. It should not be happening. That's the lesson I'm getting from those statistics. This is one of those things. There's no room. You can't decentralize that. It shouldn't be happening to begin with.
So last one's agricultural control. Another one that I don't think we're talking about nearly enough.
Not nearly enough, right?
And needs to be controlled absolutely locally. So government regulations are killing independent local farmers. Family farms have been in families for generations after generation, taking out the local food supply and replacing it with a one-size-fits-all corporate food policy. The question becomes, do we want our food supply controlled by the federal agencies and corporate interests, or do we want a local food supply? And the scary statistics here are federal policies determine 70% of farming subsidies, which benefit large agribusinesses over local farms. Over 20 billion in subsidies goes to the top 10% of farms who probably don't even need it. 50% of small farms report being unable to compete due to federal agriculture regulations and compliance. 8 in 10 US farms are required to follow federal pesticide use guidelines, even if it doesn't work in their local area. Federal guidelines require 100% compliance for genetically modified crop use, limiting natural farming practices. 30% of local farms have shut down in the past decade due to restrictive federal policies. And those are small farms,
of course,
most of the time. Federal land use laws now impact over 200 million acres of farmland, not to mention what Bill Gates has bought up, being the largest owner of farmland. 70% of family-owned farms face zoning restrictions due to federal environmental mandates.
Again with the zoning, and of course it's the Green New Deal stuff we're talking about that's messing them up, targeting the most vulnerable and the smallest of farmers. That's always big for the big, man. You'll hear me use that phrase a lot. I'm sorry to cut you up. This is one of the ones that gets me really infuriated. Again, another one. This one's just not so much scary as it is just infuriating. The big for the big in play when it comes to the food supply is probably the most ominous. If you think about it, like I attribute this trend that you're describing with all these statistics to, like, forgive me for it's not hyperbole to me. I actually believe this. It's famine from the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. That's what we're talking about here. The dystopians want us dependent and essentially want to starve us. It's not even, you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist. It's what they're doing. There's no other excuse for this. They want us to starve. The cliche, we are the carbon they want to reduce. I'm sorry, there's no other reason for all the statistics that you're rattling off except for that. They want a highly centralized food supply, and they want and the whole idea of food production and the whole concept and methods by which we produce, grow and produce and distribute food makes no sense anyway. It's already completely disjointed and is counterintuitive from the word go, because it favors, again, big for the big government favors big farm in this case, not big pharma, although they favor that too, but big farming. And it's there's no excuse for it in a free society.
2 more stats and then we'll wrap it up. But
okay, I didn't mean to interrupt the stat flow, but man,
no,
you got me going.
I knew zoning was going to get a comment.
Yeah, again with the zoning, federal zoning shouldn't exist. That's another thing that shouldn't exist. The only zoning that should exist is at the local level and open to public forum and for local use only. There should be no state, not even probably county, but certainly not federal zoning anything.
The government spends $4 billion on agriculture inspections every year, with strict penalties for noncompliance, which, of course, strict penalties can be paid for by a large agribusiness much easier than a local farm that's struggling because of all the other nonsense that's going on. And 65% of local produce is subject to federal food safety audits, increasing operational costs. So they're trying to make it impossible to even buy stuff locally.